They burned it. I didn't believe it at first. I thought maybe the wind had knocked it down, or a neighbor's bratty kid had pulled some prank. But no. My husband's American flag, the one he carried through 2 deployments and folded with trembling hands at the funerals of 5 of his brothers in arms, was gone. Not stolen. Not misplaced. Burned. By the HOA. Non-compliance with community aesthetics, the notice on our door read like some cruel joke. And standing smugly in her golf cart, sipping a kale smoothie and pretending not to see me shaking with rage, was Patricia Witherspoon, the HOA president, self-appointed savior of bland conformity. That was the exact moment I realized we weren't in a neighborhood anymore. We were on a battlefield. Our home was supposed to be our quiet place. My husband Frank and I moved to Azalea Grove 3 years ago after he retired from the Marines. He had served for 28 years. I was a nurse for 25. We wanted slower mornings, warm coffee on the porch, and neighbors who waved when they walked their dogs. For the first few months, that's exactly what we had. Frank installed his flagpole in the yard like he always dreamed of, and every morning at dawn, he would raise that flag himself. His hands were calloused, his back stiff, but his salute was always sharp, crisp, and full of pride. That flag wasn't just cloth, it was memory, pain, friendship, survival. You don't just take that from someone. But Patricia Witherspoon did. The warning letters started 2 weeks ago. At first, they were just annoying. Your mailbox is too dark, your garden gnome is unapproved, your bird feeder is positioned in a manner inconsistent with HOA Regulation 7.2.2. We laugh. I posted one on Facebook with the caption, HOA or FBI? But when the notice about the flag arrived, we stopped laughing. It read, Flagpole installation not approved by HOA board. Flag must be removed within 48 hours or it will be disposed of. I marched down to the HOA office that same day, legal codes printed out and highlighted. Frank didn't come. He said if he saw her face, he might lose his temper. Patricia Witherspoon greeted me with a Botox-stretched smile and the condescension of a Walmart return manager on her 15th hour of the shift. We honor our veterans, she said. But rules are rules. We can't make exceptions. I told her the freedom to display the American Flag Act of 2005 literally made this an exception. She squinted, blinked, and changed the subject to decorative uniformity. I left before I threw her hydrangea-scented candle at her head. The next morning, the flag was gone. Not folded, not saved. Gone. A neighbor caught it on camera. 2 HOA maintenance workers, one holding the flag, the other lighting a match. They burned it. In the community garden bin behind the HOA clubhouse. They didn't even deny it. I marched over, footage in hand, and Patricia said, it was disposed of safely. That's what matters. Frank didn't speak for hours. I sat next to him on the porch and watched his knuckles turn white. When he finally did talk, it was just one word, bury. He buried what was left of the charred base of the flagpole in the backyard, under the lemon tree. He didn't say anything else. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling while Patricia's smug little face haunted me like a bad perfume. You don't just burn a Marine's flag and walk away. You don't turn a man's pride into ashes because of your obsession with beige fences and overpriced mulch. So, I made a decision. I was going to burn her back. Not with fire, but with everything else. First thing the next morning, I rallied the troop. Not literal troops yet, but close enough. Our neighbors, Bob and Gloria, who got fined for planting sunflowers too tall. Marcia, who got a notice for her Halloween decorations lasting 3 days too long. And Jerome, whose teenager was banned from playing basketball in their own driveway. The more I asked, the more stories poured in. Turns out Patricia had declared war on the entire block, and we'd all been fighting alone. Until now. I named our little band the Lawn Rangers, because why not have fun while planning petty revenge? Our goal was simple. Annoy, confuse, and overwhelm the HOA legally and hilariously. I printed mini American flags and told everyone to stick them in their lawns, mailboxes, even potted plants. We started blasting military anthems from Bluetooth speakers at 7 a.m., perfectly within noise ordinance hours. We dressed our lawn gnomes in camouflage and draped banners that read "Support Our Troops" over HOA bulletin board. Patricia tried to fight back, of course. She issued more fines, one for a patriotic wind chime deemed excessively reflective. She sent angry emails with bullet points and passive-aggressive font choices. She held an emergency HOA meeting and invited residents to discuss a recent wave of lawn-based insubordination. I RSVP'd yes, and volunteered to bring snacks. But what she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that the fight had only just begun. Because when you take something sacred from a veteran, you're not just picking a fight with him, you're picking a fight with every person who's ever loved him, stood beside him, waited for him to come home. And some of us bite back harder than she ever imagined. The HOA thought I'd get tired. They thought I'd back down after a few more fines, maybe a strongly worded letter or a cease and desist. But they clearly underestimated just how far a retired nurse with a vendetta and a color printer can go. With the flag gone and Patricia's smug face burned into my memory like a mosquito bite I couldn't scratch, I launched Phase 2 of Operation Suburban Justice. I wasn't just going to annoy her, I was going to orchestrate a legal, absurd, and unforgettable uprising so annoying it would haunt her pastel-colored dreams. The first assault came in the form of decor. Patricia loved regulation, especially when it involved symmetry, neutral colors, and suppressing anything remotely interesting. What she didn't count on was how creative a bunch of ticked-off neighbors could get when pushed far enough. We started small. A few garden gnomes holding tiny American flags, flamingos wearing camo bandanas, and wind chimes shaped like bald eagles. By day 3, every lawn on our street looked like a cross between the 4th of July and a flea market sponsored by Bass Pro Shop. We stayed within the rules, of course. Nothing taller than 12 inches, nothing offensive. Just proudly, aggressively, wonderfully patriotic. Then came the flamingo siege. It was Bob's idea, actually. He's an ex-Marine with a wicked sense of humor and a surprisingly artistic flair for lawn chaos. We discovered a loophole in the HOA rulebook. There was no cap on the number of individual decorations as long as they weren't obstructing pathways or causing public distress. Challenge accepted. Overnight, we planted 432 plastic flamingos, each with a tiny American flag in its beak, across every visible patch of grass in the neighborhood. The result was majestic. Patricia came out for her morning power walk and stopped dead in her tracks when she saw her once pristine sidewalks turned into a red, white, and pink flamingo parade of rebellion. The expression on her face made the entire operation worth it. Of course, retaliation was swift. She sent out HOA fines like confetti at a New Year's Eve party. I personally received citations for inappropriate ornament density, use of politically charged animal paraphernalia, and, my favorite, disruptive wind behavior due to excessive flag presence. She tried to ban patriotic music after Jerome installed a speaker in his birdbath that looped the Star-Spangled Banner every hour on the hour. But our local ordinances protected us. We weren't breaking laws. We were just playing by the rules better than she ever had. But I knew we had to escalate. So I volunteered to cater the next HOA meeting, disguising my infiltration with a tray of suspiciously patriotic sugar cookies shaped like stars, eagles, and, for those paying close attention, middle fingers. I walked into that beige conference room with a pitcher of sweet tea and a smile that said, "Oh Patricia, bless your heart." She didn't even realize she was walking into an ambush. I brought charts. I brought graphs. I brought spreadsheets cross-referencing every HOA fine issued over the last year. I showed patterns, biases, and expenses that didn't line up. Like the $700 the HOA spent on decorative office plants that never appeared. Or the $1,200 allocated for a new printer that, according to the office tech guy, never arrived. I wasn't just playing petty anymore, I was aiming for her throne. Her smile faltered as I clicked through slides, each one more damning than the last. Neighbors who had never spoken out started nodding. Gloria whispered to her husband, and he pulled out his phone to record. Patricia tried to regain control, but the damage was done. Her voice got shriller, her excuses shakier. I ended my presentation with a close-up photo of the burned flag from the security footage, faded and singed, paired with a quote from Frank's viral Facebook post. This flag flew over my outpost in Helmand. Now it's ash in a suburban garbage bin. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Patricia cleared her throat and mumbled something about needing time to respond appropriately. Then she adjourned the meeting early, claiming a sudden migraine. The cookie tray was empty, and the HOA board members looked like they'd been hit by a very polite freight train. Still, Patricia wasn't out of the game. She had one more trick up her sleeve. A week later, I received a thick envelope stamped with legal notice. She was suing me for defamation, targeted harassment, and conspiracy to undermine community trust. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my lemonade. Then I forwarded the notice to Greg, our lawyer friend from the VFW, who laughed even harder. Conspiracy to undermine community trust, he said. What is this, a town or a Cold War spy novel? Greg didn't just help me respond. He drafted a counter-notice with a list of potential claims against the HOA, including emotional distress, property destruction, and violations of federal veterans' display protections. He also made a call to a few contacts, and before long, word of Patricia's flag-burning antics began to spread beyond our little neighborhood. Veterans groups started reaching out. People began posting their own HOA horror stories under the hashtag #FlagJustice. A local news station even reached out for an interview. Frank stayed quiet through all of this, watching everything unfold with a quiet kind of pride. He didn't want interviews. He didn't want attention. All he wanted was the flag back, and maybe a little peace. But I could tell something had changed in him. He was standing straighter again. Watching the neighborhood unite reminded him that what he fought for wasn't lost. It had just been hiding under layers of rules and pettiness. But Patricia wasn't hiding. She was unraveling. Her emails to the neighborhood became more erratic, filled with bold fonts, exclamation points, and vague threats about legal consequences for participating in rogue decorative resistance. It was glorious. Every time she tried to fight back, she exposed herself more. And then, one morning, Frank finally spoke up. He walked out to the front yard, stood where the flagpole used to be, and started talking. Not yelling. Just talking. About what the flag meant. About the friends he lost. About the silence that comes with surviving when others don't. Neighbors gathered around. Some brought chairs. Some just stood in silence. When he was done, someone started clapping. Then another. And another. Frank looked surprised, like he didn't expect anyone to understand. But they did. Because it was never just about a flag. It was about dignity. About standing your ground when someone tries to take away the things that matter most. And that day, as the sun set on a neighborhood now buzzing with pride and something that almost looked like unity, I knew one thing for sure. Patricia had started this war, but we were going to finish it. By the time the third week rolled around, our little street looked like a patriotic amusement park run by a bunch of mildly deranged Eagle Scouts. But behind the festive chaos, things were getting serious. Patricia was done playing nice. Not that she had ever actually been nice, but now the mask was fully off. She wasn't just sending fines anymore, she was waging war with paperwork. I opened our mailbox to find 6 envelopes from the HOA in one day. So, they weren't even pretending to be subtle anymore. One of the violations cited the unauthorized use of colors not within the HOA-approved earth tone palette. The offending object? A potted plant with bright red flowers. I didn't even get mad. I just held the fine up to the sun, laughed like a supervillain in a soap opera, and taped it to our front window like a badge of honor. I was collecting them now. Patricia might have thought she was burying me in bureaucracy, but all she was doing was giving me more material. Every fine, every threatening letter, every misstep was documented, catalogued, and archived by yours truly. I was the suburban Aaron Brockovich now, armed with a highlighter, a printer, and absolutely no intention of backing down. Then came the fine war. It wasn't just us anymore. Other neighbors began comparing notes and realized Patricia had ramped up enforcement across the entire community. Bob got fined for having a basketball hoop that was audibly present. Gloria got hit for having her American flag-themed garden stones labeled as unauthorized paving elements. Even little Marissa, who lived 2 houses down, got a warning letter for drawing chalk art on her driveway that was too visually stimulating. It was like the HOA had turned into an abstract art critic with a grudge. The community started to crack. People were furious but unsure what to do. So I hosted a potluck in our driveway, not just for the food, but as a war council. Everyone brought something: cookies, casseroles, a gallon of sweet tea that could have solved half the world's problems. I stood up on an overturned bucket and gave what I thought was a decent little speech about how we had to stay united, had to keep the pressure on. That's when Frank stood up. Frank didn't do speeches. He didn't do much talking at all unless it was absolutely necessary. But that night, he took off his cap, cleared his throat, and told them what happened the day the flag was burned. He described the outpost where that flag flew, the men who didn't come home, and how he'd folded that flag at a dozen memorials, each time hoping it would be the last. He talked about what it meant to carry it home, to place it in our yard, and to have it destroyed by someone who didn't know anything about what it stood for. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye on the block. I thought that would be the end of it, a cathartic moment. But it turned out it was just the beginning. Frank's story went viral. Marcia had recorded part of his speech and posted it to Facebook. The video exploded overnight. Suddenly, people from all over were commenting. Veterans, families, strangers who knew the value of a flag when they saw one. News outlets began reaching out. Veteran support groups wanted to help. People started mailing small American flags to our address with handwritten note. It was beautiful, and it terrified Patricia. Her response was to double down. She sent a cease and desist letter through an HOA lawyer she probably found on the back of a bus bench. It accused us of inciting hostility, misrepresenting the HOA, and, my favorite, creating a hostile lawnscape. She demanded that we remove all patriotic decorations within 72 hours or face escalating legal consequences. That letter went straight to Greg, who responded with the kind of lawyerly smackdown that should be framed and hung in the Louvre. He cited the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, local ordinances, and a laundry list of HOA missteps, including the unauthorized destruction of private property. He also added a little cherry on top, a warning that we were preparing to file a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory board. I imagined Patricia reading that email while clenching her teeth so hard her Botox trembled. Still, we weren't prepared for the next stunt. Patricia held a press conference, an actual, ridiculous press conference in the community clubhouse parking lot, complete with a banner that read HOA Unity and a podium she clearly borrowed from a church basement. She spoke for exactly 6 minutes, delivering a painfully rehearsed statement about how rules and order are the cornerstones of harmony and how emotional responses must not override community standards. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. We regret any inconvenience caused to the veteran in question. However, emotional symbolism does not entitle residents to bypass the HOA's vision for visual balance and neighborhood aesthetics. Emotional symbolism. That's what she called it. Not service. Not sacrifice. Emotional symbolism. Frank didn't say a word when we watched the footage. He just stood up, walked outside, and started digging. He didn't tell me what he was doing at first, but I watched from the window as he dug a small hole under the lemon tree and carefully placed something inside. When I asked him later, he just said, "I'm putting the ashes to rest properly this time." He meant the base of the flagpole, the part that still had soot on it from the fire. That's when I knew he wasn't just angry anymore. He was mourning. That night, I made a call to someone I hadn't talked to in years. Lou, Frank's old squad mate and now a regional coordinator at the VFW. I told him what happened. About the flag. About the neighborhood. About Patricia's press conference and her cold, polished dismissal of everything Frank had lived through. Lou didn't say much, just paused, then said, "We'll take care of it." 3 days later, the first call came. Then another. And another. Veterans from all over the state wanted to be part of something. They didn't just want to send letters or repost hashtags. They wanted to show up. To march. Peacefully, respectfully, but loudly. Because if there was one thing they knew how to do, it was march. And in that moment, as I hung up the phone and looked out at our lawn full of flags, gnomes, and ridiculous flamingos, I realized we had gone from a neighborhood drama to something bigger. Patricia wanted a tidy, quiet community where no one asked questions and everyone followed orders. But she forgot something important. When you push people too far, especially people who've already fought for their homes once before, they don't just roll over. They rise. And sometimes they march. It started with one rumble. Not the sound of anger or yelling, but a low, steady hum that built in volume until it wrapped around the neighborhood like the beginning of a summer storm. Frank and I were standing in the driveway, coffee cups in hand, when we heard it. The unmistakable roar of engines, dozens of them, approaching slowly, deliberately. It was a sound that meant something, not just noise but presence. We turned the corner of our street just in time to see the first group of motorcycles pulling in, flanked by pickup trucks with flags waving tall from the beds, and rows of veterans in full uniform marching behind them in rhythm. I didn't cry, not then. I think I was too stunned. I had known Lou and his crew were planning something, but I hadn't expected this. I thought maybe a small gathering, a dozen vets, some media presence. But this was a full-blown, high-visibility, no room for interpretation march through the heart of Azalea Grove. There were over 100 veterans, many with medals on their chests and stories in their eyes. Some walked with canes, some rolled in wheelchairs, some with prosthetic legs, some with service dogs at their side. Every single one of them held a flag. And they weren't just carrying banners of the United States. They carried POW flags, service branch flags, even folded flags representing the ones who never came home. The HOA office sat right in the center of the neighborhood like a beige little palace of petty authority. And that's exactly where the march was heading. Patricia had no idea. We made sure of that. She was inside, according to a neighbor, preparing a newsletter about the upcoming community mulch sale. She probably thought the worst of it had passed. She didn't know she was about to witness the quietest, loudest reckoning of her life. As the march came down Azalea Lane, residents emerged from their homes. At first, it was cautious curiosity, then shock, then applause. Families lined the sidewalk. Children waved little flags. A few neighbors saluted. People cried. Not the kind of tears reserved for spectacle, but the kind that came from understanding, from recognizing pain and pride in equal measure. And at the front of it all was Frank. He walked tall, not leading like a general, but simply walking with them, alongside them. Equal. A part of something bigger than himself again. When they reached the HOA building, no one had to say a word. The veterans simply stopped and faced the office. One of them raised a bugle to his lips and played tap. The air shifted. Even the birds went silent. The weight of that moment, of what had been taken and what was being honored, pressed down on everything. And just as the final note faded, the doors of the office opened. Patricia stepped out, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they desperately wished they were anywhere else. She was wearing one of her usual pastel blazers, perfectly ironed, with a smile that was trying too hard. But the moment she saw the full extent of the crowd, that smile flickered, cracked, and vanished. She tried to speak. We weren't notified of any. Lou stepped forward. He wasn't holding a flag. He held a framed picture of a young man in uniform. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply said, "You burned our brother's flag. This is how we answer." There was no yelling, no threats, no chaos. Just presence. The kind of quiet, unshakable presence that didn't need permission. The veterans began reading names of fallen soldiers from their unit. One by one. Each name followed by the city and the war they didn't return from. The list went on and on. Some of the readers choked up. Some stood firm. But no one looked away. Not even Patricia, who stood frozen like someone being shown every bad decision she'd ever made. News cameras arrived midway through the reading. Someone must have tipped them off. The moment they showed up, Patricia straightened her back and tried to speak to them, but no one was listening. The cameras turned to Frank. He hadn't prepared a speech, but when asked, he gave one. Short, simple, and cutting. He said, "That flag wasn't just mine. It belonged to my brothers. You don't have to understand what that means, but you damn sure don't get to destroy it and call it policy." And then, as if perfectly timed, one of the veterans unrolled a brand new American flag. It was pristine, crisply folded, and tied with a navy blue ribbon. The crowd parted as he stepped forward and placed it gently on the steps of the HOA office. "For the next one you try to take," he said. "This one doesn't burn." The message was clear. They weren't just standing up for Frank. They were standing up for every vet who had been disrespected, dismissed, or disregarded in 1,000 tiny ways by people who thought authority gave them the right to erase sacrifice. Patricia didn't respond. She couldn't. What could she possibly say? The newsletter in her hand slipped from her fingers and scattered in the wind. The board members behind her stepped back, not wanting to be associated with her any longer than necessary. And when she finally turned and walked back into the building, it wasn't with the usual tight-lipped control she liked to display. It was with the gait of someone who had finally realized they had lost. The march ended as gracefully as it began. The veterans dispersed slowly, many stopping to shake hands, hug neighbors, or kneel down and talk to the kids who had been watching. Frank stood near the flag on the HOA steps for a while, looking at it like he was saying goodbye to something he'd never fully been able to let go of. When I came to stand beside him, he didn't say anything. He just reached out and took my hand. Later that evening, the neighborhood was quieter than it had been in weeks. But it wasn't a tense silence. It was peace. Real peace. The kind that comes after a storm has finally passed and you know the roof held firm. Neighbors brought over casseroles and drink. Someone even set up a speaker and played country music from the porch. Nobody mentioned Patricia. But her legacy wasn't quite over yet. Inside the HOA building, someone had recorded the entire event, every name read, every flag raised, every tear shed. That footage made its way online, and once again, it spread. People weren't just hearing about a flag anymore. They were hearing about a community that stood up, about a man who remembered, and about a woman who learned the hard way that control has limit. We didn't celebrate that night. We remembered. We watched the sunset with chairs pulled into driveways, and for the first time in a long time, Frank smiled while looking up at a flag. Not out of sadness, not out of duty, but out of pride. And that was worth more than all the fines in the world. It's funny how quickly a place can change once the silence is broken. The same driveways, the same sidewalks, the same hedges trimmed into HOA-approved submission, but now the air felt different. Lighter. As if the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath for years without realizing it, and now, finally, it could exhale. Frank and I stood on our porch the morning after the march, watching neighbors pass by with nods and waves that felt warmer than before. Some stopped to chat. Others simply paused at the edge of our yard to look up at the new flag flying on a temporary pole Lou had brought the night before. It wasn't official, it wasn't HOA approved, and it didn't need to be. It flew high and proud, and not a single complaint had been filed. 2 days later, the HOA held an emergency meeting. This time, they couldn't keep it quiet. The entire community showed up. Chairs spilling out onto the lawn, people bringing clipboards, water bottles, even popcorn like it was opening night at a theater. The board looked nervous. Not just Patricia, who hadn't been seen much since the march, but the others too. The ones who had backed her silently for months, maybe years. They weren't just worried about optics anymore. They were worried about consequences. Greg came with me. Not as a lawyer this time, just as a witness. He leaned back in his folding chair, arms crossed, with a smirk that said he was enjoying the show. I stood up when the floor opened for community comment. I didn't need to say much. The crowd had done the work already. There were residents with stories, with photos, with receipts. Literal receipts from expenses Patricia had signed off on that didn't match a single documented purchase. One woman had tracked down the missing printer funds. Turns out Patricia had used HOA money to buy a new home office setup for herself, labeling it as Community Technical Resources. Someone else had traced those decorative plants to a boutique nursery that shipped straight to Patricia's daughter's college apartment. The board squirmed. Patricia tried to defend herself at first. She launched into a shaky speech about order and standards and responsibility, but it fell flat. The crowd didn't boo. They didn't shout. They just stared. Silent. Unforgiving. There's a certain kind of justice in stillness. Patricia finally faltered, sat down, and for the first time since she'd burned the flag, she looked small. Really small. Like all the power had drained out of her, and all that remained was someone desperately clinging to a version of control that didn't exist anymore. The vote to remove her passed with a landslide. 79 in favor. 2 against. 1 abstention, probably her husband, who had been pretending to check emails on his phone the entire meeting. She didn't storm out. She didn't cry. She just stood, nodded once, and walked away. And just like that, the queen of the Beige Empire was dethroned. What came next wasn't revenge. It was rebuilding. The board appointed an interim president, Marcia, who'd once been fined for having garden lights that were too whimsical. Turns out whimsical people make great leaders. One of her first acts was to repeal every flag restriction and push through a new rule explicitly protecting the display of American flags, veteran memorials, and other forms of patriotic expression. She even proposed a permanent flagpole in the HOA common area, dedicated to the veterans who lived in Azalea Grove, past and present. The motion passed unanimously. The VFW helped organize the dedication ceremony. Frank was asked to raise the first flag. He didn't hesitate this time. He stood straight, his uniform pressed, his eyes dry but shining. As the flag climbed the pole and caught the wind, the entire crowd stood silent, watching. No phones, no distractions. Just the sound of the flag flapping and the weight of everything it meant. When it reached the top, a trumpet played the national anthem. Not a recording. Live. One of the neighborhood kids, who had been practicing in secret after hearing about the march, stood off to the side, cheeks puffed, pouring everything he had into that horn. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Frank turned to him after and said, "You did good, kid." The boy beamed like he'd just won the Medal of Honor. In the following weeks, life settled into something new. Not quiet, but peaceful. The lawn flamingos slowly disappeared, replaced by actual flower beds and neighborly gestures. People helped each other with yard work. The HOA meetings turned into real discussions instead of lectures. Patricia's house went up for sale with a listing that read, "Charming home in a community known for its patriotic spirit." Someone, probably Bob, snuck onto the property one night and planted a sign on the lawn that read, "Flag Lovers Welcome." It stayed there for 3 days before it mysteriously vanished. One afternoon, I found Frank in the backyard, digging again. But this time, it wasn't solemn. He was clearing space for a new garden, right near the lemon tree where he had buried the ashes of the old flagpole. I brought him a lemonade and sat beside him as he worked. He told me he'd been thinking about planting something that would bloom every year around Memorial Day. Not for him, he said, but for the ones who didn't come back. I said I'd help. I had a whole Pinterest board of ideas already. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, I thought about how close we'd come to letting something sacred be erased by petty rules and power trip. And how easily that could have happened if no one had stood up, if no one had said, "Not this time." It wasn't just about the flag. It was about community and memory and the right to hold on to the things that matter. Frank didn't need a speech to make people understand that. He just needed to raise the flag again. And he did. Every morning since the new pole was installed, Frank has walked to the center of the community, flag in hand. He raises it slowly, methodically, the way he did on base all those years ago. Neighbors have started joining him, some in silence, some placing hands over hearts. The flag flies taller than it ever did in our front yard. Not because of a rule, but because of a choice. A choice to remember. A choice to respect. A choice to stand. So yes, Patricia burned our flag. But what she didn't know, what she could never understand, is that some things can't be destroyed by fire. Some things only rise from the ashes stronger. And now, every time that flag catches the morning wind, it whispers through the neighborhood like a promise. We're still here. We're still standing. And we're not going anywhere.